The air was crisp, biting at the exposed skin of Tony's face as he carved through the snow with smooth, practiced precision. The night skiing on Dead Man's Bluff had been perfect so far, the cold mountain air invigorating as he raced down the slopes. He could hear the laughter of his friends behind him, and when he reached the bottom of the hill, they gathered, breathless and grinning. That was insane! Matt clapped Tony on the back, his breath forming clouds in the air. You ready to hit the lodge? Tony glanced up the slope, the ski lift slowly churning. The slopes had emptied out, and the lights bathed the mountain in a soft orange glow. The last runs of the night were wrapping up, and most skiers were already heading inside to warm up. But Tony wasn't quite done. He had spotted her earlier, a lone figure gliding effortlessly down the mountain, her ski form graceful, almost hypnotic. He had been trying to catch up to her, but she always seemed just out of reach. I think I'm going to go for one more, Tony said, his eyes still on the slope. One more? Matt raised an eyebrow. The lift's shutting down soon, man. You don't want to get stuck up there. I'll be fine, Tony waved him off. I'll meet you guys in the lodge in a bit. I just want to try and catch up to someone. Matt gave him a look, half concerned, half amused. All right, but don't freeze your ass off. Tony watched as his friends headed toward the lodge, then turned back toward the ski lift. There she was at the base of the lift, her sleek black jacket standing out against the snow. Her breath puffed out in soft plumes as she glanced up, waiting for the lift to bring her back to the top. She seemed utterly at ease, completely in her element. Tony quickly skated over, positioning himself beside her. Hey, he said, flashing a casual smile. You going for one more too? She turned, giving him a smile that made his heart race. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes bright with the excitement of the night skiing. Yeah, last one of the night. Figured I'd make it count. Same here, Tony said. I'm Tony, by the way. Lily, she replied, shaking his hand briefly before they both moved to board the ski lift together. The chairs swung around, and they sat down side by side, the safety bar lowering with a metallic click. The lift began to carry them up the mountain, the world below them slowly shrinking. The lights from the lodge grew distant, and the only sound was the steady hum of the ski lift's gears. They rose higher, and the night grew quieter. Tony stole a glance at her. She was staring out over the snow-covered trees, her breath misting in the frigid air. So, you ski here often? He asked, trying to strike up a conversation. She smiled. First time here, actually. I usually ski out west, but I wanted to try something different this year. What about you? I come here pretty often. It's not the biggest, but the night skiing's pretty good, Tony replied. He found himself wanting to keep talking, to draw her into conversation, but a strange sense of unease was slowly creeping over him. The lift had been climbing for what felt like an unusually long time. They were halfway up the mountain now, but something was off. The slope beneath them had become obscured by the thick forest, and they couldn't see the base or the summit anymore. The lights on the slopes below them seemed to have disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Is it just me, or does this seem slower than usual? Lily asked, glancing down. Tony frowned. Yeah, it does. Maybe it's just the end of the night. The lift operators are probably getting ready to close up. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. The lift didn't just feel slow, it felt like it was struggling, the hum of the gears growing louder, more labored. And then, without warning, the lift jerked to a sudden stop. They swung slightly in their seats, the wind picking up and cutting through their jackets. The world around them fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the soft creak of the lift as it swayed in the cold wind. Tony stared down. Below them, the ground was far enough away that jumping was out of the question. Sharp rocks jutted out from the snow in uneven patches. The drop was easily 50 feet. If they jumped, they'd be risking broken bones or worse. Lily let out a nervous laugh. Guess we're stuck for a minute. Yeah, Tony replied, trying to keep his voice calm. But something felt wrong. He checked his phone, no signal, not that it surprised him this far up the mountain. He put it back into his pocket and tried to push away the growing sense of dread. They sat in awkward silence for a few minutes, the cold beginning to bite at Tony's fingers even through his gloves. The lift didn't move. "This is taking too long," Lily said, her voice tight. "They should have gotten it moving by now." Tony nodded, looking up toward the top of the mountain. But the summit was lost in darkness, the faint lights from the ski runs below barely reaching this high. The only light came from the stars above, their icy glow offering little warmth. And then, as if to drive the situation into pure hopelessness, the lights on the slope below flickered once, twice, and then blinked out. Darkness swallowed the mountain. "Oh no," Lily whispered. "The lights are off." "Tony, why are the lights off?" His heart raced, panic starting to take root. Maybe it's just a glitch," he said, though even he didn't believe it. "They'll probably get it fixed soon." But as the minutes dragged on, there was no sign of movement, no hint that anyone was coming. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature plummeted even further. Tony pulled his jacket tighter around himself, but the cold was already seeping in, biting through his layers. Lily shifted uncomfortably beside him, her breath coming faster, more ragged. "Tony, what if no one's coming? What if they shut everything down and didn't realize we were still up here?" The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. It was possible. If the lift operators had assumed everyone was off the mountain, they might have turned off the lift and gone home. He glanced down at the sharp rocks far below them and shook his head. "They'll notice," he said, though his voice wavered. "When we don't show up in the lodge, they'll come looking for us." Hours passed. Their initial panic had shifted into numb terror. The cold was relentless, draining the warmth from their bodies until their limbs felt sluggish, their minds clouded. Tony had tried yelling for help, but the wind carried their voices away, leaving them alone in the black void of the night. Lily was trembling, her face pale, her lips turning blue despite her layers. Tony tried to huddle closer to her, offering what little warmth he had left. But it wasn't enough. "I'm so cold," Lily whispered, her teeth chattering. "I can't feel my fingers." Tony's heart pounded in his chest, the frostbite setting in around his exposed skin. He clenched his hands into fists, trying to keep the blood flowing, but the cold was insidious, creeping into his bones. His mind raced, searching for any solution, any plan, but he kept coming up short. Jumping wasn't an option. They'd be dead the moment they hit the rocks below. But if they stayed, they'd freeze to death before morning. He had to do something, and then, in a moment of raw, primal desperation, an idea wormed its way into his mind. It wasn't something he could even fully process. It was just there, an instinctual urge born from survival. His eyes flicked to Lily, her gloves, her jacket, her hat, and scarf. He needed them. He needed them if he was going to survive. Tony swallowed hard, trying to shake the thought away, but it persisted, gnawing at him as the wind howled around them. "Tony." Lily's voice was weak, barely audible. "What are we going to do?" He didn't answer. His gaze had locked onto her gloved hands. He felt his heart thudding in his chest, his breath quickening. The cold was making him delirious, making him think things he never would have otherwise. But if he didn't act, they were both going to die. Without warning, without even thinking, Tony's hand shot out. He grabbed Lily by the arm and punched her square in the face. She gasped in shock, her body going limp as she lost consciousness. For a moment, Tony just stared at her, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his mind reeling. Then, mechanically, he stripped off her gloves, her jacket, her hat, and scarf. He fumbled with his own frozen hands as he pulled them on, layering her warmth over his own body. His fingers ached, but the extra insulation was enough to keep the frost at bay for a little longer. With trembling hands, he raised the safety bar of the lift. He stared down at Lily's motionless body, still slumped in the seat beside him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words were hollow, lost in the howling wind. And then, with a single, brutal push, he shoved her off the lift. Her body tumbled through the air, a dark shape against the snow, and then disappeared into the darkness below. Tony sat back, his heart racing, his body numb. He wrapped himself tighter in the stolen clothes, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he waited for morning. The hours crawled by, the cold seeping deeper into his bones despite the extra layers. His mind felt detached, distant, as if floating in a fog of freezing despair. His limbs grew heavier, his vision blurred, and eventually, the dark void of sleep claimed him. When the sun finally rose, the ski lift roared back to life. The operators, unaware of what had transpired during the long, frozen night, powered up the machinery. At the base of the lift, the workers noticed the approaching chair. A lone figure sat slumped in the seat, his body stiff, his face pale and frozen. They hurried to the lift, calling out, but Tony didn't respond. As they drew closer, they realized why. Tony sat frozen solid, his eyes wide open, his body locked in a permanent expression of terror. He had not survived the night, despite everything he had done. The mountain had claimed him too,